My name is Karen Whitehair, and I've been a gardener for my whole life. I had a stepfather who loved to watch things grow, and so he would do crazy things like try to grow watermelon in Montana. It didn't go very well, but he liked the process of watching it grow. And unlike the rest of my siblings who, when they hear yard work, they run screaming the other direction, I actually enjoy it. And so I'm here to share my journey with you about what I learned. Let me share you a little bit about how I got involved in this. In July 2019, my family moved here to the Middletown area. We were moving up here because we wanted to get our daughters, our twin daughters, to a better high school. And so we had a time crunch, and we had to kind of make a selection of a variety of houses, and the houses that we picked was the one that we all could tolerate. It was a compromise. Now, as you can see, the house, the backyard is basically a grassy plain. It basically is just filled with nothing but invasive species grass materials. The front yard is a classic suburban landscaping scheme with Eurasian plantings, and as we found out when we pulled them up, that they actually were more like science experiments. They're what they call cultivars, and we'll talk about those in just a little bit. And in comparison to where we had been in Charles County, which is where we moved from, there wasn't a lot of activity there. There weren't a lot of animals moving through. We didn't see a lot of things happening. We also started noticing some odd situations. So for example, we go like, oh, there's a butterfly. And then we'd look at it and go, oh, this is a sulfur, or this is a cabbage white moth, who are generalists. And they really are not, they focus on just they really like to have the dandelions and things like that. But we didn't really see any other butterflies or moths. My husband and I one time were walking out in the yard, and we looked down on the grass, and we saw this bumblebee that was just sort of laying there, and it was kind of behaving like I was drunk or sick or dizzy or something. And it's like, there's something wrong with this. And it's like, this isn't good. And my family and I have been participating in bird watching activities for a long time, and so we were really sensitive to the birds around us. And we would periodically hear the cries of the broadwing hawk or the Cooper's hawk, instead of seeing them flying up above. And we had a bunch of turkey vultures that liked to sit on top of the water tower that was across the street from our house. But we found out soon enough the reason, because we had this grassy plain of a backyard. They kind of liked the heat convection that came off of all that grass and during certain conditions, and it would create the great thermals that they loved to soar in. And so it's kind of disconcerting to look up and go, oh, this is a bad sign. We also, we had been participating in the Cornell Lab of Ornithology feeder watch for years, and always had a lot of activity on our feeders. But we dutifully put our feeder out, and hardly anybody showed up. We were really excited when a male and female house finch finally came, but that was about it. And that fall, after the feeder watch program started, one weekend after we had done our monitoring, I had to send a report in for the first time saying we had no birds sighted during our monitoring period. And at that moment I said, oh, okay, we got to do something different. So I contacted the National Arbor Day Society and went through their catalog of trees. I had just finished reading Doug Tallamy's book, Bringing Nature Home, so I knew I have to get some oaks here. So I planted some oaks. It was really kind of funny because these trees are only about 2 or 3 feet high, and they arrive bare root. So when they come, you pretty much have to get them in the ground. But they arrived just after Christmas, and so my husband and I were out there digging holes in the dark, in the cold rain, trying to get them in as fast as we could. And believe it or not, actually, almost all of them survived. Only one of them didn't. And that location, nothing seems to want to grow there anyway. So part of me wants to know what's wrong with it, and another part of me doesn't. But that spring, we walked our way over to the local nursery, And I had taken a list from Tallamy's book, and I was determined to kind of keep to, I'm only going to get natives to this particular area, to the Mid-Atlantic region. And we walked in, and we started noticing all kinds of other sorts of plants. And my daughters would go, but Mom, it has the genus and species here. It's okay. But it's a miniature. And it has this weird name on the back of it. And we'll talk more about that later. But it has this cute little name. But I'm not sure if I think, Mom, it'll be okay. So we got 3 miniature bee balms. Well, okay, we'll see what happens. And then also, as chance would happen, a mail order catalog for native plants showed up in the mail. And I figured, well, what do I have to lose? Except for some cash. I'll order some and hopefully it goes okay. And I did, and got those in the ground. And believe it or not, magic happened. That summer, the blossoms came up. There were all kinds of insects all over the blossoms, from all shapes, sizes, colors. It was just magical. And we started realizing that there were a lot of insects we'd never seen before. Like there was this little teeny tiny green bug that looks like a fly, and we later learned that it's a bee. And then my husband got really excited. He's like, I think we have hummingbirds. And so we went out and we looked at it more closely and went, that doesn't look like a hummingbird. It turns out it's something called a hummingbird moth. Who would have ever thought? The birds that we had longed to see when we put out our bird feeder actually started coming. And then we had the honor of being able to, we looked down at our plant that's called a butterfly milkweed, which has these little orange flowers. We started realizing there were little caterpillars that were white with green and gold stripes on them. Monarch butterfly caterpillars. We started realizing that we had something between 10 to 25 monarch caterpillars on each one of these plants. And we had fun watching them get bigger and bigger, and while the poor butterfly weed had been getting smaller and smaller and smaller, it was okay. And we watched one crawl over to a leaf, basically start hanging from that leaf, and kind of doing almost like a Taoist prayer while it was preparing itself to do its chrysalis around itself. And then this beautiful green and gold trim chrysalis showed up. Then after a couple of weeks, we watched this chrysalis sort of become transparent. We could see the orange forming and the black forming. And then it came out. And we got to watch it. It was crumpled up for a while with all kind of wrinkled wings. And then it would just kind of flap a little bit and to try and get the wetness off its wings, and they get wider and wider. And then it would fly over and land on one of the coneflowers of one of the bergamot to fuel up, to fly south on its migration. It was magical. One thing I learned from this experience was that if you plant the plants the pollinators need, the pollinators will find you. And it doesn't take much. Whoops. What did it do? Okay. The wildlife and a lot of other things came to be a part of it. One thing that also happened now that we've had the pollinator go up for a while is that other plants started showing up that we didn't plant. So for example, because we removed the turf that had been there and we'd stopped mowing, we had goldenrod just come up as volunteers. It was just waiting to come up. So most of the goldenrod in my yard now is actually just volunteers. We didn't plant them. Other plants, there's this wonderful little daisy-like flower that's called fleabane. That came up. It turns out that it's a really important spring pollinator plant. And then just last year, this funny little ground cover plant came up, and I was panicking, thinking, oh no, it's another invasive I have to pull up. This is bad. But we did our research and found out it's something called a Carolina geranium. Some people call it a cranesbill because the seed looks kind of like a great blue heron head and beak. And so nature was starting to try and take itself back. So why did this work so well? Okay. So why did this work so well? Well, we need to step back and understand a little bit about the science behind it. And I promise this is not going to be too technical. So, I would like to ask you, who are the pollinators? Can you give me some ideas of who you think might be pollinators?
Bees and butterflies.
Okay, there's bees.
There's also little flies, like the ones that go on the daffodils and stuff.
Yeah, there's bees and butterflies, and there's actually a variety of bees. We probably all grew up thinking that bees, their homes were in hives, right?
No, well, some actually, that live in the ground too.
No, there's some bees that form colonies in the ground, exactly. There are other bees that overwinter and put their eggs in the stems of flowers like goldenrod. There are other bees that actually put their young in holes in wood. And these are docile. A lot of the solitary bees are actually quite docile. They won't sting at all. And then so we have the butterflies and moths. And believe it or not, most of the flying insects that you see are probably going to be moths more likely than butterflies. There's also birds, although not quite as much. We'll talk more about one of their more important jobs in just a bit. Any other ideas of who pollinators might be?
Beetles?
Beetles. Yep, beetles. People forget about the beetles. Okay. Any other ideas or suggestions for what might be a pollinator?
Gnats.
Gnats. Okay. Another possibility?
Ants. Ants.
Ants. Yes, I'll be getting to that in just a little bit. Okay. Here's some other possibilities. There's wasps. You're going to see wasps on your flowers, and that's okay. One of the things to kind of keep in mind about both bees and wasps, some people are afraid to do pollinator gardens because they're afraid that they're going to get stung. Well, I'm going to tell you a little story about my daughters. They took an insect camp at University of Maryland, and one morning after they had finished that camp, it was kind of a cool morning, and they said, "Mom, come out and pet the bumblebee." And I was like, "What? You want me to do what?" "Mom, it'll be okay. Come and pet the bumblebee." And so, because it was cool out, and bumblebees sometimes will like overnight on the blossoms. You can actually go out, if you're really gentle, you can go and pet them. You don't want to push too hard, but you can actually pet them. And it'll start going bzzz and get a little bit annoyed with you, but if you respect them, they'll respect you. I mean, they're like too busy trying to do the work that they want to do. So they will probably not sting you. You kind of have to like ask to get stung. So just kind of keep that in mind. If you respect them, they'll respect you. Bats. There's nighttime pollinators going on, and bats are one of the prime sources of that pollination. Flies, as someone mentioned earlier, there's lots of varieties of flies that pollinate. People freak out when they see mosquitoes on their blossoms. One thing to kind of keep in mind is that there are something like 54 different species of mosquitoes in the state of Maryland. Only 3 of them will bite you, and 2 of those were introduced. And half of the populations of those 3 are the ones that will bite you. Only the females bite, not the males. And for the 2 that were introduced, they can breed in just a cap full of water. So as long as you keep stagnant water off your property, chances are you're not going to have a mosquito problem. But the mosquitoes that are on your blossoms, they're probably not going to do anything. They're probably not the ones that will bite you. It's because there's so many others, and they're vital to the environment. They're a key food source for a lot of organisms. As somebody mentioned earlier, ants are also pollinators, but probably the job that they do more. So ants are actually they're really good seed dispersers. So pretty soon we're going to start seeing like Virginia bluebells lining the roadsides. It's the ants that help to spread those seeds. That's just an example. Birds are also excellent seed dispersers. Rodents and other mammals, as well as, believe it or not, reptiles, are also seed dispersers. We kind of like lump everybody under pollinators, but there are a lot of organisms that are helping flowers to go through their reproduction cycle and distribute their seeds. So we need to kind of keep that in mind when we are planting our gardens. Now, taking a look at this list, what kind of animals do you mostly see? Well, the squirrels are good at that too, dispersers. Okay, there's mostly insects. Okay. So, but there's something important that we need to consider. I'm going to read this quote out loud. If all mankind were to disappear, the world would regenerate back to the rich state of equilibrium that existed 10,000 years ago. If insects were to vanish, the environment would collapse into chaos. This is a quote from E.L. Wilson, a pioneering evolutionary biologist from Harvard University. We often don't think insects really matter. They're just these little creepy crawly things, and who cares? But they're really the engines that make the world work. They're the ones that help with the plants to go through their sexual process, the reproductive process, as well as distribute their seeds. They're also key players in decomposition, in breaking down wood and plant matter. Think about how messy the world would be without them. There are also a lot of services that they provide that we really don't pay attention to. But the thing is that without them, the world would not function. We need them. One thing to kind of keep in mind is that there's no such thing as a bad insect. Now, I don't like ticks. I hate ticks. But ticks are actually a really critical food for animals like wild turkeys, believe it or not. So everything plays a critical role in the environment. Another key point to consider. Without plants, life as we know it would not exist for two reasons. First of all, plants give us oxygen. Through the process of photosynthesis, we get our source to oxygen. If we don't have oxygen, we wouldn't be here. Another key component is that human beings do not have the ability to harness the energy of the sun directly to run our metabolisms. But plants do. They literally take the energy of the sun, carbon dioxide, water, and through the process of photosynthesis, create that oxygen as well as the glucose that fuels everything else. Okay. Plants also provide important services such as filtering our air and filtering our water. Your plants are critical to life on this earth as we know it. And again, just like there's no bad insect, there's not necessarily a bad plant either. But now you're going, why are we being told to plant native species? Well, we'll answer that. Okay. The word native is kind of loaded. Some people get offended by it. Some people are like, well, it's a moving target because, as the environment changes, the boundaries for where certain species are going to exist are going to be shifting around and moving. And so how can you determine what's really native? Do we go back how many years? There's a lot of questions. Other people are like, well, we're just continuing the process that's always existed because, things have moved around. Well, that's true. But the reality is that never before has that movement of organisms been as rapid as it is now. Before, the fastest it could go was the speed of a current of a stream or an organism walking. But now, we can pick something up in Europe, in Asia, in Africa, in South America, and get it here within half a day. It's too fast. Evolution doesn't work that fast. So this is what's going on. So when we talk about being what is native, Doug Tallamy, who is a professor of entomology at the University of Delaware, and is somebody who has led the charge in helping people understand how important plants and insects are to our very well-being, and Rick Darke, who is a horticulturalist, they decided to come up with a definition that maybe they hope will solve the controversy over this. So what they mean by native is a plant or animal that has evolved in a given place over a period of time sufficient to develop complex and essential relationships with the physical environment and other organisms in a given ecological community. The key component there is mutually beneficial relationships, ecosystems. Ecosystems are what makes the world work. So how do ecosystems work? Basically, over thousands of years, a diverse group of species find themselves in a particular area, and they evolve to survive in that particular area. And because of the competition between different species, they develop unique solutions to their survival. They fill particular niches. They develop certain attributes that help to make them survive better in that environment with all the other competition. And because of this, a lot of times they develop mutually beneficial relationships. This is sort of the key to the pollinator plant relationship. Pollinators receive nectar and pollen that they need for their food and to help them reproduce. And then plants receive assistance in reproduction and seed dispersal. It's kind of, I scratch your back and you scratch mine kind of thing going on. Other species develop different strategies, such as generalists. Generalists are insects that will basically, or organisms that rely on a lot of different kinds of foods. Sort of like the white cabbage moth, who, if it has nectar, it will land there. And that's all it cares about. As long as there's nectar, it's there. Yeah.
That's actually a butterfly. White cabbage butterfly.
Oh, actually, my source said moth. I'm sorry.
Yeah, my mother used to call them moths, but I've been clarified on the situation. They're out during the day. They're not around at night. They have the thin, narrow antennae. They don't have the feathered antennae. So they're actually butterflies. They're very common.
Yeah. But they basically, the point for this is that, you know, they were willing to take they use a lot of different sources for their food.
That's why they're so common.
That's why they're so common.
Yeah.
But specialists, on the other hand, because they found a niche that hadn't been filled, and so they developed a tool to be able to survive in that niche. They often rely on one type of plant, one species of plant, for one phase of their life cycle. For butterflies and moths, a lot of time that's in the larval state, and most of us would call the caterpillar state. And so they can only have that species. There are a handful that may have 2 or 3 species that they rely very heavily on. But most of them have a single host plant. And this is something this is what happened to the monarch butterfly. Their host plant wasn't being planted, wasn't spreading. It was usually getting pulled up. And so they were starting to lose their food source during this critical phase of their life. Now, ecosystems work, when they're working really well, everybody in it. And it's not just a handful of species. I mean, this is going to be like thousands of species. If you go to the Amazon rainforest, within a square mile, you may have 10,000 species all gathered in a single ecosystem. But when an ecosystem is working, everything in an ecosystem gets enough food in order to be able to survive and to be able to reproduce at the level that they need in order to continue their species. But what happens if somebody goes, I really found this great grass or this great flower in let's say Africa or South America or Asia, and they bring it back and plant it. This plant didn't evolve with the other plants that were already here, did they? So, because they don't have anybody eating them, because basically in their ecosystem, there is something that eats them to kind of keep their numbers under control and manageable. There may be diseases that also help to keep it under control. But over here, there's nobody. And so they're going to do what plants do. They're just going to reproduce. And they start like shoving out the plants that were here. So what happens to these insects that are dependent upon the plants that were here?
They die off.
They die off, yeah. And to kind of take that, another step further, most people, again, we all were brought up to think the nest is the bird's home. Well, not really. It's where they put the eggs, and that's where the nestlings are when they're not quite mature enough to be able to manage on their own. But during during that nest period, it's an incredibly dangerous time. So birds really do not want to spend a lot of time in that nest. Some species may only spend about like 5 days, and then their young fledge, which doesn't mean they fly off. They actually might be running around in the underbrush, and their parents are still feeding them, even though they're not in the nest anymore. Some birds may go up to like 3 weeks. So we're just going to, for discussion purposes, we're just going to say 2 weeks. Okay. Now, for the birds that come to our bird feeders that we see pretty regularly, they are not feeding their young those seeds because their young are not ready to eat those seeds. They aren't going to necessarily be feeding them insects either, because if you've ever broken a nail, you kind of realize that keratin in your nail can get kind of sharp. So they're not going to be feeding their young those either. What they're looking for is this incredibly nutritious sort of Cheeto-like thing that contains a lot of protein and a lot of fat and a lot of vitamins and minerals. And that are the caterpillars during this critical stage of growth. And believe it or not, depending upon the species, one nestling might eat during that 2-week period somewhere between 5,000 and 12,000 caterpillars. Okay, so we've brought this beautiful blossom from South America, and it's basically shoving out the plants that had been here. So the plants that have been there aren't able to provide food for the larvae of the butterflies or moths. So basically then there aren't those larvae to feed the birds. So what happens to the birds and their populations?
They die off too.
They die off too. Yeah.
Or they go somewhere else.
It goes someplace else. And that's what happens. Basically there's this kind of like domino effect. All ecosystems are incredibly fragile. And all it takes is just some kind of disruption to disrupt that very fragile balance. And this is why pollinator gardens matter. This is a quote also from Darke and Tallamy's book, The Living Landscape. Humanity's challenge is to reduce its introduction of rapid environmental change, including change caused by introduced species that are currently causing extinctions to occur faster than the evolution of new species. This is why if we plant the plants that the pollinators need, the pollinators will find you because they're hungry. They're really trying to find the plants that they need to be able to go work through their life cycle. But then we run into this dilemma of where do you find the plants they need? One would think, well, it's native. They should be really easy to find, right? Well, no, they're not. As I mentioned earlier, my family and I, that first spring we were here, headed to the local nursery. And of course what we saw were a lot of what are called exotics or non-natives. Because we have to keep in mind that the local nurseries, their main cash cow are landscapers. And landscapers want particular kinds of plants. They want things that have a particular shape, have a particular color, have a particular attribute. And so they want to make sure they sell those so that they can have the profit they need to be able to stay in business. So it's really easy to walk in and think, well, of course the nursery's not going to do something wrong. Well, they have plants there that are not going to be beneficial to the local ecological communities. Also, if they do have native plants, they may have something that are called cultivars. Basically, these are plants that are bred for certain attributes, whether it's color or it's shape, or in the case of our 3 miniature bee balms, having them be really small and cute. But the problem is that they're not bred for food, for animals. They're basically bred for what they look like. and what they represent. So, for example, those 3 miniature bee balms, since we're talking about the white cabbage, they would land on those bee balms, but they would like pick around a little bit and then would fly off. They wouldn't spend a whole lot of time there because there wasn't anything there for them. There wasn't any food. A lot of cultivars, if they do produce seeds, they're not as nutritious as the pure native varieties are. So it's really critical not to encourage the sale of these because they really don't benefit the natural environment. So how do you avoid them? Well, one quick way to be able to tell is what's listed there is for a corabelle, and it's called it has a cute little name, citronelle on the side. Sometimes they'll have like snowbells or rainbow blossom or something really catchy to get you to buy them. But that's usually a key sign that they are a cultivar. Sometimes they'll actually have like an X. They're more subtle about it, and they'll have an X between the genus and species. That's another sign that you probably don't want to buy those. The better direction to go is to look up native plant sales. Montgomery County has, especially like in their park system, has a lot of plant sales. There's some other organizations there that have a lot of plant sales during the year. For the green team, if you go to our webpage, if we know about plant sale, we will put it up so that you can go to those plant sales. There are also some retail plant nurseries that specialize in native plants. One that I'm pretty familiar with is actually Homestead Gardens, which is in Davidsonville, just outside of Annapolis. There's also Sunny Meadows that is near Boonesboro. Then there are also some that are like northern Baltimore, some in Pennsylvania, and some in Virginia. And on the resource list that's on the back table, there are several different tools you can use to try and find those native plant nursery distributors. Then there's online catalog native plant retailers as well. But one of the things I want to caution you, one time I was thinking about going to a plant sale in Prince George's County, and I looked at the list of the plants they were being offered, and they were offering, one of them I saw was a purple loosestrife, and I nearly lost it because purple loosestrife is a Eurasian plant. It's beautiful. I can totally understand why it got brought over. It's gorgeous, and it's a wetlands plant. But the problem is that it's gotten out, it's starting to spread, and it's starting to push out the native wetland species all up and down the eastern seaboard. So why they didn't catch that one, I don't know. But the point is that you have to be careful. You have to do your homework. You have to investigate and learn what is, from this particular region and what isn't. You can't assume that, they're saying it's an implant stuff, so everything's okay. No, you've got to protect yourself. So, I drive my family crazy, but I actually photocopied off the Mid-Atlantic section of Bringing Nature Home in Tallamy's book, and I don't go to any plant sales without it. And so if that genus and species is not there, I don't buy it. And you have to be that hard-headed, because otherwise you might buy something that will not be as productive as you want it to be. In order to change things around to get the local nurseries to start bringing in native plants, you have to be that hard-headed about it. So know what you want to buy before you shop. Now, we have the ability to turn things around one garden at a time. Okay? And keep in mind that the size of your garden doesn't matter. People are like, well, I live in an apartment. I can't do anything. Actually, you can. If you have a balcony or a porch, you can go to Home Depot or to Lowe's and get one of those big rubber pots, fill it with dirt, and put in some native plant species, seeds in it. You may be like, well, it's not much of an impact, but it is. It's moving in the right direction. You've done something positive to help the environment. Encourage your friends to also begin to plant more native species in their yard. And for those of you who need to have some kind of metric to how successful am I at this, you can look at the number of pollinators that are on your flowers. But probably the best way to measure how well you've done, are the number of caterpillars you see. Because that really is the metric that proves that you've had a positive impact. Because those caterpillars make all the difference. So if you plant the plants that pollinators need, the pollinators will find you.